Thank you very much. It's good to see my professors here, my colleagues, and also different people from other projects. Thank you so much. I'm honored. And I want to thank you, Dr. Hannah, for the opportunity to present today. All right. So as my topic for today is perspective of young herders in context of agropastoral change in northern Benin. And because of our time, I'll go straight to our agenda for today. So briefly, I'll have an introduction, then I'll talk about my research approach to understand the perspective of young herders, or the topic that we are discussing, which is ethnography. Then we will look at intra-household relations, so focus on roles, responsibilities. I'll give a case study, which I caption it, The Boy Who Voted with His Feet. Then we'll also go into some narrations, then we'll go into analysis and discussion, and finally, a take-home message. All right, so 1 second. Yes, so as way of introduction, as we all know, with agropastoralism in northern Benin, and not only in northern Benin, but agropastoralism in, let me say, mostly in Africa per se. So integrating livestock and rearing subsistence with crop cultivation is a key strategy or a key livelihood strategy among Fulani communities. In northern Benin, cattle rearing, it's a common practice among Fulani communities. Of course, this is changing and it's blending, but traditionally it has been the domain of Fulani as an ethnic group. And when I say Fulani as an ethnic group, I do not want to mean they are as like one people homogeneous, but it's just to show that this particular ethnic group is associated with pastoralism. So then we focus on the changing land relations. And so having understood that pastoralism in the past has to do with nomadism, or let me say semi-nomadism, that is moving from one geography to another. But with changes in demography, changes in the environment, agricultural expansion, we have seen pastoral communities settling in specific areas. So settling, and probably the term I'll refer to is sedentarization. So most communities have sedentarized. And in the process of their sedentarization, have integrated crop farming into their traditional role of pastoralism. So then, when I look at changing land relations, I'm not talking about necessarily with their geography, but I'm looking at the relationships that have changed. Of course, when people were nomads or when people were moving and now have to sedentarize, the relationship that they had among themselves and also with the people that they have sought the land from changes. So that is the focus when I talk about the changes in their relations. So for instance, in the household, we could have looked at a father, a mother, and other extended members within the household, and their relations to other neighboring communities or neighboring neighbors. But once people begin to sedentarize, then the land uses is changing, and then the relationship that the people have among themselves also changes in that stead. So probably to explain this point better, we understand that tenure rights are not fixed, as in it's in bundles of relationships among people. And so when people, especially when nomads were mobile, that is having their land use as mobile, moving from one place to the other, and now they have to sedentarize or now need to stay in a particular geography, we see the competition on the land use, and also we see how people begin to shift on how they relate to each other. Let's say, for instance, if I could borrow you land, I now understand your mobility, not just as a temporal use of the land, but I understand your mobility or your land use as a permanent, or let me say, change to the land. So of course, it causes frictions and tensions, which later we'll be looking at. So the objective for our discussion today, we are going to see how young herders perceive and navigate labor relations, compensations, orientations amid ongoing agropastoral change. Let me explain this objective a bit, because in context of agropastoral communities, if you look at families, you might think that where does compensation come from? Since we understand that nomadism, or if we understand that pastoralism has to do with identity and history. So people tending for cattle for their family. So why do we introduce the term compensation? In the subsequent chapters, we are going to, or the slides, we are going to see. 1 second. Okay. Apologies, I want to move to the next slide. Good. So briefly, let me explain my approach, or let me say our approach to the field. So ethnography, as we all understand, integrating into the field of field immersion. And for this particular case, I'm going to look at, I'm going to analyze a social process, and this I'll focus on Gleiser's approach to analyze social situations. So as we'll be seeing in the discussion, young headers' perspective is not just, let's say, it's fixed, but we'll be seeing negotiations and how they relate with their the people in the household. So this will explain why we capture this as social processes. So my research context is a community in northern Benin, in Chauru commune, Bukusera, and surrounding Fulani pastoral camps. And then Bukusera is a Fulani sedentarized community. So for Fulanis, they have patrilineal kinship, and their social structure is endogamous marriage. So that should also explain to us that these people are related, so they have strong kinship networks or strong kinship ties. Their land uses are interconnected, and of course, very competitive because we have farming, we have farming as in crop farming, and also pastoralism. All right, so briefly, I want to put up a scenario here to explain how household works, or let me explain this as a typical Fulani household. So a typical Fulani household, derail, or let me say, it's different from our understanding of a nuclear system. In Fulani household, it's more of an extended household or extended networks. So as we can see here, we have the father, which we say the patriarch, the matriarch, because the father has two wives here. So we have the father, Adamu, and with his two wives. Then we have also other sons. So as you can see from my legend, so we have males, we have females, we have unions, then we have siblings. Somebody might be asking, so if we are showing this extended family, does it mean that they all live within the same household? Important to mention that Fulani's understanding of a household is not only with people who are geographically present. So I'll cite an example. For instance, if I take number one, which is a male, and his father is Adamu. So he is still part of the household in as much as he's not living within the household. He contributes to the household. So he keeps the head in another community. We realize that in sedentary communities, because the land is getting scarce, like there's more pressure on the land. There's the need to have more of the heads move to other geographical locations. And the head belongs to the family. So while the head belongs to the family, it is it's some of the sons who needs to take the heads to different locations, but still part of the household. So for instance, we can have one son in another community taking care of the head. Then we have some heads being maintained in the community to provide milk and also to support with farm tax in the homes. So we can have a header, we can have other members of the household. So for instance, we can have one member of the household who can be a nurse or a teacher and still send remittances and still contribute and still comes home very regularly. So our understanding of what a household is, as I mentioned, it's untypical to what we term as nuclear family. Let me also mention here, you can see on the green, we have members of the household who are not direct relatives. They belong to the kinship, but they are not direct relatives. So in traditional Fulani context, you can have relatives coming in to support your household. So these are where I'm going to be talking about where the labor arrangement comes in. So if a son is working for a father, that son, in terms of compensation, we will not term it as compensation because he's contributing to the household production. But when other people who are also relatives are brought into the household, then the arrangement changes. So there we introduce the concept of compensation. It's also important to know that even among the sons, now societies are changing. So even the concept of even the concept of being part of a household and your labor being termed as a chore or your labor being termed as a task is also changing. Even among sons are also receiving compensation because they also need to build their, let me say, their families, also their wealth. So that explains a bit of what we mean by a typical household. So in this typical household, there we see that it's a site of contestation because In as much as they are together, you might say that, okay, they share common, they have common descent, they have common lineage. But we also see that individuals have different experiences. Individuals have different let me say, different orientations or different wants and different needs. So in the household, we see several contestations, which later our case is going to explain to us. All right, so quickly, I want to share a case study here. 1 second. I want to read some excerpts from my notes. Okay, please, can you still see from my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, but it's not anymore in presentation mode.
My apologies. I want to read an excerpt. I have it on my, so I'll read from my side here. So I show a case, and the case I titled "The Boy Who Voted with His Feet." So my entry to understanding young members' perspective to labor relations starts from this particular case. So I'm going to read here. I never learned Issa's full name. He is Adamu's grandson, 11 years old, perhaps 12. During my first month of fieldwork, he was present in the household. Most mornings, I'll catch a glimpse of him from my window, already in motion. Sometimes he had taken breakfast, other times he was in a hurry with his breakfast. At times his sandals were slipping, then I could see him guiding the herd out. Issa cared for about 13 cattle, and most evenings around 6 p.m., Issa would be returning with the herd. But prior to Issa returning, I could hear his voice. And these were voices he was speaking with his herd, long before I could hear also or see dust filled in the air. Then the cattle followed. Issa then tied the animals for the night, and minutes later, I could see Issa running and laughing with his siblings. At this particular time, when I observed these, I never bothered to ask Issa's relation to the household. In Fulani context, they will say, also in French, they will say the même famille. So I never bothered to ask how the relation, how compensation with Issa's taking care of his grandfather's head was like. Then after my exit from the field, when I mean exit, I took a 3 months break from the field to analyze the first data that I have gathered. So on my return to the field in July 2024, Issa was not in the household. I asked his grandfather, Adamu. He told me Issa ran to his parents. Later, through a key informant, I got to know that Issa had been brought from his village to tend for his grandfather's head. Not his direct grandfather, but grandfather from his father's side. The compensation arrangement was that he will receive 1 cow every 6 months of work. But during that time during one day of his work, a calf went missing. Issa lost a calf. That's what his grandfather puts it. His grandfather spread news around neighboring villages, asking if anybody have seen the calf, and the calf was never found. His grandfather Adamu decided that the compensation for Issa for the first 6 months of labor could instead compensate for the lost calf. Issa, faced with the loss of this promised reward, chose to return. He chose to run from this village and return to his parents. All right, so I'll put it in the presentation mode again. 1 second. All right, please, I hope it's in the presentation mode again. Okay, so from this narration and this case that I have observed, then my attention began to go into how household relations and compensations are formed. Of course, Issa's story is not alone. So what I began to do was to pay keen attention to household, especially to younger members. I began to ask questions of people's relationship and engaging with the herders in their daily routines. There were moments they could sit on my veranda. There were other moments I could also take a stroll with them during their herding activities. I began to engage in conversations with them to understand not only with the compensation, but also how they were faring. Then once I had taken notes of the relations and once I've taken notes of the dynamics of their working conditions, I also followed up with focus group discussion. So in the focus group discussion, what I did was I understand that these are young boys. So although they will engage with me, but I also needed to seek consent from their parents. I mean, parent not as in biological parents, but let me say the people that they are living with. So I began to engage with the household heads to ask if I could have conversations with the younger members in their household. And what we did was that we grouped them into families. So our idea of grouping them into families is that we understand that households are not uniform, and also families are not uniform. Various families have their different arrangements. So we grouped them into families and began to engage into conversations. And I've picked 4 key conversations or narrations from these young headers that I want to discuss here. I'll start with the second one. One of the young headers said, I was somewhere working with my uncle, my father's younger brother. They sent me back home saying, I don't know how to rear cattle well. It is because I was never interested. And for all the years I spent there, I never received a single cow. Every 6 months, I was supposed to get one. But before the time came, my father would go to my employer, collect the money and spend it. I kept laboring without result. After going home, my father brought me here again. It is now 3 to 4 years. What pains me the most is that whenever he collects the money, he tells no one, not even my mother, until he has spent everything. I have 2 elder brothers. One died last year, the other has gone to Nigeria, and it's only my younger brother with me. And I want to contrast this with a similar, or let me say another case whereby the young header expresses that he's willing to, or he's more interested in the job. So the narration 3. I like rearing cattle. I told my father to help me find a place to work. That is how he brought me here. They never put me in school in the first place, or they never put me in school from the beginning. I have had no interest in school. This is my 4th cow I'm working towards. I should have had 4 cows by now, but my father is sick and they have been selling the cows for his treatment. Okay, so when we look at the second narration that I stated, we realize that in as much as the boys have been brought to the community to work or have been brought into the household to work, they also possess forms of agency to decide what to do within this household. So in the case of the narration 2, we see that the boy was sent back because in the logics of their parents, this boy doesn't know how to take care of her herd. But then the boy is contesting or resisting in a way that he says, it's not that I don't know how to take care of a herd, it's that I'm not interested. So in as much as, because he's not an adult to negotiate or to verbally say to that, I'm not interested, he chooses another way. So similar to what Isa, as we saw in the first case did, Isa did not speak. Isa chose to leave. So leaving, it was a reaction to the compensation or to the forms of compensation that he was being refused to. And in the second scenario, we also see a young man saying that I'm not seeing the work that I'm doing. And then in order not to show to them that I'm resisting, why don't I then show attitudes that I don't know how to take care of a herd? And then in showing attitudes I don't know how to take care of a herd, my father sends me back. Okay, because of our time, I'll go into the analysis and then we will see this case. Pardon me, I want to also read my notes here. Okay, so we see that labor relations are constituted through kinship negotiations. Important here is that in kinship logics, when we talk about header's role or a position of a young man, in kinship logic, it has to do with obligation. So even the concept of compensation as an arrangement it's not formal. So in kinship thinking, it has to do with members of the household contributing to labor or contributing to agricultural production. So we are not discussing formal contracts here, but rather compensation as an arrangement. What we saw from the cases is that these compensations are not fixed. They are renegotiated based on the relations that people have among themselves. So people can invest in social relations. For instance, in the case of Isa, we saw his from his father's side, and then he came to take care of his grandfather's cattle. So investing in social relationships also gives people access to get forms of, let me say, forms of labor or forms of people coming to work in the agricultural production. But what we note here is that the same kinship that sustains agricultural production, that's, or let me say, that ensures the labor production, it does not sustain agropastoralism. Let me explain this point here. in the sense that these boys are, let me say, the futures, or their futures is linked to the agropastoralism, in that most of them are not going into school, or most of them are not learning other trades. So agropastoralism is what they have been passed on, and in future also following the traits of it. But then what we saw is that in as much as the kinship brings them in to learn, so it's a form of socialization, but the same kinship also to an extent, I don't want to use the word betray, but the same kinship also to an extent disrupts their thinking about how even pastoralism work in the first place. Let me explain a bit here. For a Fulani young boy to tend for a cow is not an economic labor, or is not for a form of compensation. In the logic of a Fulani head boy, to tend for a cow is a passage, or is a form of social belonging. Because for these boys, it has to do with their knowledge of the head. It also has to do with they coming into adulthood, their independence, their interdependence, and also ability to be able to form households, or let's say form communities of their own. I explained this in the sense that in the village, or let me say in the field, what we realize is that people who had chosen other trades, or let's say they have gone to school, or they have engaged in other trades, when it comes to marriage, it took them a bit of time to get to marry, compared to people who were, let's say, into farming, or people who were herders. For herders, it was easier because they have been socialized, probably I put it that they have been more socialized into becoming or gaining a social position in the household. So a young boy or a young man at the age of 20 can claim herds of his own because he has been able to work for it. But what we see with the changes in the compensation is that in the past, whereby a young man, let's say 20 or 25, could claim a head, the compensation of these young herders, which could push them or which could put them into their futures, are being disrupted. So we see that, for instance, some boys say that my parents have sold all the herds, or I'm working till I'm in my 7th year, I have no cattle, or I have no cow. So in as much as, let's say, compared to the past, people were, or their positions were being secured in terms of employment, in terms of, let's say, having access to their own head, we see that these young boys, for theirs, it's being disrupted. Okay, 1 second. Okay. We also note that becoming as in a social becoming for these young men, it also changes how they think about agropastoralism. In literature, we find that we say most youth are not interested in agriculture. This is the argument here. We tend not to understand the underlying conditions, not making youth not interested in agriculture. So we could also say that most young people losing interest in pastoralism. But the underlying conditions, as we have seen from the case, is not because they tend not to have interest in the pastoralism, but because of their compensation, or because of the labor relations that they are having in the household. So for them, what we saw is that some of them could choose to run. If they are younger people, or if they are adults, then they could migrate to the cities. So in conclusion, because of our time, maybe I'll leave the rest for the discussion. So in conclusion, we say that the young herders' compensation, their labor relations and orientations are important, as these shapes the future of agropastoralism. I will explain the point here a bit. When we talk of agropastoralism in rural context, it's not with, let me say, it's not with capital, as in people having the ability to go and purchase cattle. It's with a kinship that is able to, probably the word is sustain, pass on these cattle, or pass on these head to younger members within the household. So if the younger members now feels, or now narrates that their compensation, their relations, and their thinking of pastoralism or agropastoralism in the first place is being disrupted, it also changed their thinking of whether they want to really have a future in pastoralism. All right, thank you so much. I think I'll end here, and then we can engage in the discussion. Thank you very much.